Good afternoon. My name is Peter Niemi, and I am one of the co-founders of a company called Recovery Plus. Recovery Plus is in the business of home-based cardiac rehabilitation. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about a topic we've all heard a lot about today, and Julie just did a great job talking about it in terms of clinical trials, telehealth as it applies to the category of chronic care management, of ongoing treatment, which is what we do. And as I was speaking with the other co-founders a few years back, we weren't quite sure if there was a fit for me. My background is in pharmaceutical marketing. I'm not a healthcare professional. They are. And yet, as we talked more and more about the challenges facing cardiac rehabilitation in particular, it became clear to me that these are really challenges of marketing and operations, of awareness and operations, much more than healthcare. And so, as Mr. Charlie Munger always tells us, stick with what you know and you'll do well. So I joined the company, and here we are today. So a little bit of background about the cardiac rehab market, just to kind of set the baseline. I'll talk a little bit about cardiac rehab, quick journey over the last eventful 2.5 years for telehealth in general, and then some thoughts about the future and how we can continue to scale. So what do we know about cardiac rehab? Really quickly, it is effective. When properly applied, it reduces readmission rates from 20 to 30%, pretty high risk factor, to single digits. So it's very effective. It's safe. It's administered by a healthcare professional, usually an exercise physiologist, monitoring patients' vitals to make sure they don't overexert themselves. It's safe. And unfortunately, the third bullet up here is it is wildly, wildly underused. 20% of people who should be in cardiac rehab because they've had a heart event, this is defined by Medicare, actually are. So 80% are not. The major reasons for that are location. One of our founders lives out in West Texas, and the closest rehab center to him is 300 miles away. It's a little ironic. He's an exercise physiologist. The other issue is time. As you go through a chronic care treatment, you tend to improve, you get better, you need to get back to work, you need to get back to your life. So it's just not economically feasible to have enough cardiac rehab clinics to solve all of the problems. So enter telehealth. Telehealth is a perfect solution for this. The promises of telehealth are it will deliver access, right? Regardless of location or time, it delivers that access. Outcomes. Access leads to better adherence, leads to better outcomes. This is the patient side. And then efficiency. The promise of telehealth for the provider is efficiency, the ability to reach and treat the patients who need their care. And so what I would submit to you here is, as we think through this in terms of chronic care, as I think about traditional telehealth, the genesis of it, it's the doctor visit. So now you've got a choice. You can go to the doctor in person, or you can go virtually. You can have a telehealth visit. What I would submit to you here is that, remember that 80% of people who should be in cardiac rehab and are not, that's our target, not the 20% who are. Telehealth is the only way to solve this problem, the only reliable way that we can deliver access to this effective care to the people who need it the most. So, go on to the next step. First, let's take a quick rewind and talk about the genesis. This timeline pretty much aligns with our company. So in 2020, as we all know, something happened, and suddenly telehealth went from an interesting novelty to kind of a niche to an absolute necessity. Many HCPs were not seeing patients in person at all. 2021 was a really interesting time. There was a big gold rush into telehealth, right? Suddenly everyone was talking about telehealth. And to put that in perspective, looked up some numbers. And thank you to Rock Health, who keeps all these numbers online, making the research for this talk pretty simple. So what did that gold rush look like? In 2019, investment in telehealth was just over $8 billion. It started to accelerate quickly as we went through 2020 and started to deal with the pandemic. And then in 2021, it really took off, breaking $29 billion in 2021. $8 billion to over $29 billion in the course of 2 years, an incredible growth. What's interesting there is that we saw this easy access to capital led to some questionable business models. I'm not going to name any names here, but there were some really interesting plays there. I swear I saw several pitch decks that had projections based on the public health emergency lasting forever, which obviously is proven not to be the case. So as we got into 2022, reality. Investment levels dropped back down to the 2020 levels. Now it's time to execute. If we're going to scale, if our objective is to get more people on treatment using telehealth, we have to be able to onboard patients efficiently and much more quickly, an order of magnitude faster than we've ever done before. Scaling and training staff. Healthcare professional burnout right around 2022 was widely documented and pretty prevalent. So keeping enough staff to keep the level of quality of care up to what you're accustomed to was very difficult. And finally, insurance reimbursement. It felt like the rules of reimbursement changed every month. So what was already a very fraught and complex billing process now became a moving target. And that was 2022, which reminds me of another great philosopher who has this to say. I had a plan going into 2022. But here we are. It's 2023. The first fully in-person HITLAB conference in quite a few years. Last year there was 1 day of in-person. This year there are 3, so nice growth trajectory. Let's keep that up. And what do we see? Reimbursement approvals. So the public health emergency has officially been declared over last month. Reimbursement approvals, the telehealth flexibilities, as it's put by Congress, have been extended through the end of 2024. So we've got a year and a half to figure out our billing strategy for 2025. That's the good news. Now, things will certainly change, but it's safe to say that the toothpaste is not going back into the tube. We're not going back to 2019 levels of reimbursement. Patient acceptance. Again, as we went from novelty to necessity, patients started getting on board. Heard from a lot of the speakers here about how elderly populations are learning how to use Zoom. Patient acceptance of telehealth has gone sky high. One stat that I saw, 73% of patients plan to continue with telehealth sessions after the pandemic. When you overlay chronic care with that, the number becomes 80%. So the vast majority of patients are accepting of telehealth. And then most importantly, HCP adoption. The healthcare professionals to get on board and recognize that telehealth is a way for their practice to be more efficient, to allow them to reach patients they otherwise couldn't reach. And again, another stat I'll put out there that really struck home with me. There was one survey where 87% of physicians said very specifically that telehealth allowed them to reach and gain the trust of marginalized patient populations. So you've got all 3 of these things going for you in 2023, particularly the alignment around the fact that marginalized populations, rural areas, lower income areas can benefit the most. So I want to get back to scale for a minute. Remember that 80% of people who should be on cardiac rehab, for whom cardiac rehab could keep from having to go back to the hospital? This is what the scale looks like when you really look at the market. This is the chart that keeps me up at night. There are 260,000 people active on cardiac rehab. That's in the US. It's about a $1.9 billion market. That's out of 1.3 million who are eligible according to Medicare. So that's a very narrow definition of cardiac rehab. A couple of very specific CPT codes. Up at the top, you see overall incidence of heart disease, including CHF. And then the really interesting line to me there is ER visits. 5.7 million ER visits in the US due to heart issues every year. Almost all of the people in that category could benefit from telehealth, from perhaps not rehab, but from preventative care, something that's a big part of our business. So if you're thinking down here at the 260,000 and saying, well, let's grow that market. Let's grow it by 10%. Let's grow it by 20%. How much? We're going to get to 300,000? So we're going to get to 5% of the people who should be on this type of care? We're not even moving the needle. We don't need to just grow that bottom level. We need to add an order of magnitude. How can we do that? So, a few thoughts on what we're working on for the future. Telehealth 2.0 or 3.0, whatever it is at this point, is what's the next level? You've got a valid model. You know that it works. Open source. Delivering chronic care to the people who need it the most is not a competitive endeavor. It's a shared endeavor. It's a cooperative endeavor. So we need to open source. We need to make access to treatment and approaches that work available to everyone. We've got an artificial intelligence engine that sits on top of our patient data, our intake data and our historical data, which delivers suggestions for personalized patient plans based on what's worked in the past. Personalized plans drive better outcomes, allow you to tailor the treatment to a wide range of patients. And in our business, we have everyone from housebound 85-year-olds to athletes who've had an unfortunate heart event. And then finally, connect and empower. This is another thing that we're talking about with our partners a lot, connect and empower. So there are 18,000 exercise physiologists in the United States, licensed EPs, all of whom are capable and trained to deliver cardiac rehab. We would love to hire them all. I'm told with great authority by our backers that that's not going to happen. So what's the next best thing? So we're thinking about this market. What can we do to empower them? Can we give them the training and the connectivity? Can we drive awareness among patients so that they know that there's a central place? They know that there's a home-based solution, right? The most convenient location of all, a home-based solution. So connect and empower EPs and patients to join each other. And when you start thinking about things like this, you really can start to see how we can use telehealth to scale chronic care management. Issue with this, all of the observations on this slide, is that this is contrary to the status quo. Status quo is based around in-person clinics. It's based around if you want to treat more, deliver more rehab sessions, then you need more space. And so all of these are challenging that status quo, and so there's quite a bit of inertia that we need to deal with. However, I would point out to you that the worst possible answer to the question, well, why do we do things that way? The worst possible answer to that question is always because that's the way we've always done it. That's not going to be good enough. We need to evolve, we need to think differently, and we need to disrupt if we're actually going to start to really realize the scale that we know we need in this category. Finally, and I know Stan's out there with the stopwatch somewhere, so I'm going to wrap up quickly. When we're talking about scale and reaching marginalized populations, we would be remiss if we didn't point out that the US is less than 5% of the world population, and think outside of our borders, despite the fact that we are responsible for nearly 50% of overall healthcare spending. So that's the telehealth market, how we can use it to scale access to chronic care, reach people for whom the alternative to a telehealth solution is nothing at all. Drive access, regardless of location and time, drive better outcomes for patients, and deliver efficiency. Telehealth is the way that we're going to be able to accomplish this in the cardiac rehab market. Thanks for listening. That's my time.